Alex is one of our colleagues at Leeds Beckett University, and today is going to be speaking on crisis, post-neoliberalisation, got my teeth in for that, and the idea of post-capitalism. So over to you, Alex.
Okay, not what I was planning to say, but just in response to what Andrew, how Andrew just queued this up. I'm afraid I might be a little bit more pessimistic than your visions of alternatives and so on. I think I've got a bad news message that what you've got is what you're going to stick to, what you're going to get. So anyway, we'll see. So the windows are all shut, so you can't, and only open so far. So there's no chance of you chucking yourself out if I'd really depress you. Okay, thanks. Thanks for inviting us. Obviously, programme looks ace. I'm hoping to stick it all the way through to the end, although some of you might discern in my voice there's a slight possibility that it'll give out by the end of this talk. So hopefully you'll manage your expectations in relation to that. But also, I haven't really got... This isn't a research paper. This is not a piece of research I'm doing. Basically, Katie asked us to come and talk. So I read the book that you're all going to come and listen to Paul introduce, launch or describe later on today. And basically my talk is some of my observations, comments, thoughts and potentially questions as we get towards the end on what came to my mind basically as I read the book. So I'm going to start with some observations on Paul's book. I'm going to come back to finish on some concluding perhaps observations and posing of some open questions at the end, and in the middle I guess what I'm going to do is offer something of my thoughts about how you might address the questions that Paul Mason raises in that book. So let me start then with the book. Sorry, you did say I should introduce myself, right? So I'm a professor here. I teach politics, international relations, and international political economy. I do that as part of, that's kind of one hat I wear. The other hat I wear is I do a lot of, despite what you're going to hear today, I do a lot of policy advice for government departments, although not the present government. As will become clear why, and international organisations. So at the minute I've just finished some work for the European Commission, and I'm doing some work at the minute for the Inter-American Development Bank. Not unrelated actually, in critical terms to where we're going to end up, which is to say that space is really important, and actually spatial expansion of capitalist social relations are the big story. Thinking about space not just in terms of either absolute or relative physical terms, but also in terms of in social terms. That's the kind of big story, and actually the work I'm doing for the IDB, the IDB's intentions really is linked to that kind of critical commentary I'm telling us about. Right, so the book, I'll offer you a bit of a précis. The book starts with a discussion of systemic crisis. In that, it's quite refreshing to see a mainstream journalist, mainstream economics journalist, talk about crisis not as in simply a kind of an interruption of otherwise normal conditions, and therefore something that will return to normalcy in the near future, but he talks about that as a systemic problem, and therefore he's immediately posing those questions and trying to address those questions in terms of thinking about capitalism as a social system. He goes on then to think about the great financial crisis, or whatever you want to might call it, as a potential turning point, as a systemic punctuation, if you like, and opening up the possibility, at least. I wasn't sure actually by the time I got to the end of the book exactly where he sat on this, but at least opens a possibility for thinking about a turning point. In that, then he goes on this massive detour, and I think an unfortunate and regrettable detour around Kondratiev and Kondratiev waves and such like, and then comes back to the idea that if crisis is a systemic turning point, if it is a punctuating moment, then two things are needed. One is an alternative set of ideas, a la Andrew's initial point, and the other is a social group that will mobilise those ideas and bring those ideas into fruition. He has a crack at the ideas, so towards the end of the book there's some reasonably radical things said about socialising finance and ending privatisation and such like. So he has a crack at providing some of those ideas. It's just discussion, but he does so nevertheless. And he identifies a social group he thinks might bring those ideas or help to bring those ideas to fruition. And that social group is described as those with the white cables hanging out of their ears, with their faces lit with the blue light of iPads and so on. Now, as I read this book, as I was just saying to Angus actually, I got halfway through, in particular in the middle of Kondratiev, and I was thinking, oh, this is the most frustrating book, There's parodies of Marx, there's all sorts of analytical problems in the middle of the book. But by the time I got to the end of it, I have to say I was a little bit more positively disposed towards it, in the sense that I think it's really important, as I said before, that a mainstream journalist addresses systemic issues in that way. It's an engaging book. I learned some stuff I didn't know. It's a good read in that sense. I think it's probably too long for its purpose, but it's a good read. It's an engaging read. It's more engaging than anything I would ever read. And it's going to talk to it's going to talk to an audience that's never going to usually listen to me or any of my colleagues, right? So I think in that sense it's a really welcome, positive intervention. And the idea that futures are open to contestation, and that if crisis is a systemic turning point, it is only so through a process of social struggle in which you need to identify mobilising social forces and ideas, then in that I would really agree with that element of the analysis. Having said that, there's a lot of optimism of the will in there, and I think basically my presentation is the pessimism of the intellect in relation to a few key points. So, pessimism in relation to understanding of crisis. I don't think crisis has to be a punctuating turning point, and that's going to be a big key analytical message. Pessimism in terms of the role of technology. All right. Yeah. Role of technology, and in particular, there's a section of the book that forced me to actually go back to the Grundrisse and read the section he's talking about, where Paul Mason's very optimistic about a short snippet of Marx's discussion called The Fragment on Machines, where he discusses the role of generalised open technology or open information. And that leads him, I think, to be massively overly optimistic, at this stage at least, about the prospects for generalised information capitalism to transform into, as he calls it, post-capitalism. And I think I'm rather more pessimistic about the prospects for the characters with the white cables hanging out of their ears and so on, as a transformatory social group. I mean, they're nice people. I don't want to traduce them on that basis, but and occasionally I wear white earphones too. But I think there's some analytical reasons to be much less optimistic about that generation. So, I suppose I'm offering something of a marginal alternative, which Andrew I saw in the corridor the other day, and he tasked me to talk about different theories of crisis. I don't think I'm going to do that. You can pick it up in questions. But so there's lots of people that would think that the distinction between the origins of crisis, either as a result of rising organic composition of capital and therefore the long-term tendency of the rate of profit to fall, already I can see people's eyes as glaze over, or something else, whether that be understood in under-consumptionist terms or in the way I would like to talk about it as a disproportionality. So I want to offer a slight alternative, and I think that's got really big kind of political implications as we come through. So first then let's start off with crisis. Crisis is one of those terms, and another one I'm going to use today is neoliberalism, or neoliberalisation is what I would prefer, that is really, really overused and massively underspecified. So we all use crisis all the time, but what on earth do we mean when we say it? So I don't really know what that picture illustrates, to be honest, other than lots of newspaper articles have appeared with crisis in their title. I thought I needed to start with a picture, so you've got a picture. All that shows us is that crisis is overused. If I'd done the hard work that I probably should have done, you know, as a kind of some kind of discoursey paper, but what I probably should have done is gone through those 30,000 articles a year in the FT and looked at the meanings ascribed to the word crisis. And I'm pretty sure that I would get two or three things. One, that it was used interchangeably with lots of ideas. Two, that it was frequently unspecified, and probably the majority of times unspecified. And three, that where it was specified, it's specified in completely different ways. So, as a means of addressing some of that, let me think about what we mean by crisis. And the simple answer is, we mean all sorts of different things. And you know, I always say this, you know, with my you know, postgrad students at least. You know, when I come to a question, my kind of way of attempting to answer that in the first place is WWMS. What would Marx say? And Marx would address this by thinking about this as a matter of perspective about different moments in a process of circulation. So crisis is an everyday experience for, in the first line there, for capitalists attempting the transformation of money into capital back into money, hopefully with some surplus value contained within it, or profit. So crisis there is about the reproduction of a circulating process. The rest of us experience crisis in our attempts to transform ourselves into employable labour and then to reproduce ourselves on a day-to-day basis by buying the stuff we need to reproduce ourselves, to experience the goods and services that we need to reproduce ourselves, not as absolute human beings, although that clearly is a baseline important step. So biological reproduction is part of that, but also human beings in a particular society holding the kinds of characteristics and goods and access to experiences and so on that become a normal part of that particular society. So that, you know, we're all here dressed in a particular way, you know, you're carrying particular things in our pockets and so on, eating particular foods in order to get here, experiencing Katie's trains and planes and so on in a particular way. So we need to provide for that process. As crisis interrupts those moments in that transfer, in that kind of circulation process, there are ways in which we can offset them. So we can offset crisis in the transformation of one stage to another through credit, for example. So, you know, most times, you know, most firms come to advancing new investment as a credit relation. So they need to access credit because they can't access the realisation of their profits prior to having to go into another turnover phase. And we do the same thing, right? So, you know, in terms of reproducing ourselves in this society, most of us access housing and a housing market where we are bound to access credit in order to reproduce ourselves in a particular social relation, often mediated through housing markets. So we access credit to help with that. Devaluation helps offset those crisis processes. So some firms don't manage to manage that process and they go out of business. Sometimes we have to moderate our expectations about what we can earn through devaluing our labour power, right? By accepting a lower wage. I've got no illusions as to the fact that if I'm made redundant now, I will probably accept a lower wage to reproduce myself tomorrow, okay? And we devalue our expectations around what it is that we can consume, how we can reproduce ourselves through consuming goods and services. And I think that's going to be a big part of my story, about my pessimistic story about our way into the future, in contrast to Paul Mason's experience. So crisis is at least a latent and potential aspect of everyday life, and that's really important. But of course, where lots of firms go out of business at the same time, and we know that they geographically cluster, such that Leeds was a textile place, and if you'd have come to Leeds, I'm going to show my age, I was going to say 10 years ago, it's not 10 years ago, 25 years ago, you would have seen the very physical inculcations of those of spatially focused crises in the reproduction of capital, in the sense that Leeds was a city in decline. If you go to Detroit today, you will see exactly that kind of spatially focused crisis that is about the switching of investment between, not just between firms, but between sectors and industries and so on. And sometimes those crises become systemic, right? So sometimes crises disrupt, in the way that Paul Mason wants to think about, the whole organisation of society through things. And you know, if you were so minded to want to use that literature, you could say that was a mode and regime of accumulation, or a social structure of accumulation, or just simply think about that in terms of the institutional arrangements around the state and the distributional aspects of that, and the organisation of technology in the way that we produce things. So sometimes crises disrupt all those things, this is not a kind of a well worked through list by any stretch of the imagination. In fact, this is a list that I use in my first years, in my first year lecture, so you can tell the degree of thought that's gone into that. But I tend to think about the nature of those systemic crises requiring a generalised crisis in the reproduction of capital, as in accumulation, so not just between particular firms, but something that's spread beyond that. Some kind of geopolitical element to that. A disruption and breakdown of a widespread disruption and breakdown of legitimacy, and a breakdown of what I'm calling that kind of second line up there, social reproduction, or the reproduction not just of ourselves, having particular characteristics in a particular society, but whole communities and the way in which they pertain over time. Okay, so if actually I'll skip and do it the other way around. If we can think then about sometimes crisis being not just an everyday feature, but this systemically punctuating thing, it might help us to think it in terms of, Browdell thinks of this. I'm not a Browdellian, but Browdell has this kind of idea of, differentiating between time, and that might be a helpful way of thinking about the things I'm trying to say, in the sense of the longue durée being this kind of epochal, long-term social structure, this thing that we have called capitalism, that started, depending on where you sit in the transition debate, so it's either sometimes 3,000 years BC or maybe in the 1500s if you go along with Brenner. And then other levels of time, other layers of time in a conjunctural sense. So we can think then, the post-war period, and what has been then the distributional, institutional, organisational structures that have organised the reproduction of capital and the reproduction of people over that period of time. Or, as I said, this kind of idea that crisis is an everyday lived reality. And that leads us to differentiate then what are the features here that are part of that longue durée time frame, and what are the features that are much more conjunctural and therefore open to transition by a crisis in capitalist development, as opposed to the systemic crisis of capitalism leading to Paul Mason's post-capitalism. And that seems to me to be a useful way of problematising the ideas that he's got there in the book. Okay, so if some crises are systemic, punctuating, and lead to a conjunctural shift, right, then how are they offset such that the longue durée of capitalism as a social system is maintained. And here I would, for the majority of the presentation, really follow David Harvey, in the sense that there are a number of mechanisms that allow those crisis tendencies to be managed. And this is where, when I said space becomes really important, and I think it's a missing element of Paul Mason's book for that reason. So we've already said devaluation can be part of coping with those systemic crises. And if you think about a shift from a kind of pre-war to post-war capitalism, the Second World War and the destruction, literally the destruction of value, was a key part of that devaluation process, at least to Harvey, and I would definitely agree with him. But also, Harvey has this idea of spatial and temporal fixes, and I'm sure many people in the room don't need me to kind of talk you through those, but those that don't already know about that. This is simply the idea that overproduced commodities or overaccumulated capital in the idea of a falling rate of profit can be displaced into new spaces that are outside of the current system. And Harvey's explanation here is that crisis tendencies in the post-war period, at least from the 1970s onwards, have been managed through a massive spatial expansion of capitalism as a social system. And that occurred in various phases, so the kind of globalization movement, offshoring and containerized shipping and all these kinds of things that we saw affect places like Leeds and Manchester and car production in the Midlands. I don't know why I point behind me for that, by the way. I don't know where it is. I've got no kind of compass in my mind. Those crises were offset through the kind of contemporary globalization. And that was given a massive boost by the end of the Cold War that opened up the Soviet Union and Eastern Europe to that same process of spatial expansion in a very painful way for the people living there. And if we look at the story today, I'm fast forwarding a little bit, but the almost doubling of the global workforce, that is people engaged directly in capitalist social relations through selling their labour power to produce stuff, that workforce has doubled since around the 1990s. And that is the big story today. And the reason I'm much less positive about, or the basic reason I'm much less positive about that being a point of possible systemic transformation now, is that process is nowhere near finished. So it's difficult to measure in terms of people and experience and how they're integrated, but one really poor quality proxy measure is this idea of urbanisation. And it's only in 2006 or somewhere like that. I'm useless at remember these facts, so if somebody's Wikipedia in it, like Paul would suggest, then you're probably going to correct me. But it's something like 2006. More than half the world's population began living in cities. That's a fair amount left to go if urbanisation is a very poor proxy for the extent to which people are entangled in that process. And of course, throughout that spatial expansion, there is a variety of ways in which either restructuring social institutions, restructuring distributional conditions, in the way I wouldn't hold to the whole of Polanyi's analysis, but in the way that Polanyi describes in the Great Transformation, in terms of redesigning distributional institutional arrangements, and in a way that legitimacy is important, as Gramsci I think really importantly highlighted. I forgot we were cultural studies people, so it'd be the Frankfurt School would give you a way into thinking about, and you will probably all know much more about that than me, but a way into thinking about how legitimacy problems both disrupted and then were coped with in terms of that kind of systemic punctuation. What that means, though, is that in spatial expansion, social struggle is really important because it determines the terms on which that reorganisation of distributional institutional arrangements is designed. So, in that sense, Paul's book is an intervention in that kind of social struggle and provision of ideas, which I think is really really important. Okay, so we've been through that. It's just a way of Stephen Gill's way of talking about that. We don't need to go into that now. Okay, the final thing I want to say then, and it links, kind of comes from what I was just saying, is that if social struggle is important, that means that spatial expansion, the resolution, or at least the displacement of crisis tendencies in a systemic sense, is a political process and draws our attention to the ways in which crises are managed. But just to flip that on its head for a moment, I would argue that in the current conjunctural phase of capitalist development, crisis itself has become an important and central governing strategy, i.e. that the inducement of crisis has become part of the way in which governing elites seek to manage the everyday process of legitimising and securing those circulation processes that I started with. And you can see that in, if you go back in time, I'm going to speak to different audiences in the room, I suppose. You go back in time to think about Thatcherism and the idea that there's no alternative to the engineering of northern unemployment through the use of monetary policy to engineer that process. That was a process of inducing crisis to manage the process of transition and the uneven development that resulted from spatial expansion. So you take in the industry somewhere else, induce the crisis here as a mechanism to manage the process of uneven development that emerges out of that. And we can see it also in the contemporary work of Jamie Peck and Susan Soderbergh and so on. Actually, I'm chair of an organisation at IPEG, the International Political Economy Group, national organisation, and we have an annual book prize. Susan Soderbergh's book, Debt Fair States, won our annual book prize today. So if you're going to buy a book as well as Paul Mason's one, I would strongly recommend you go and buy Susan Soderbergh's book. It's a very good one. Probably coming to, as Paul would tell us, to some file sharing site near you sometime soon, or no doubt actually already there. And this is a process, right, thinking about journalistic interventions into very substantive academic debates as being, positive and, welcome. This is exactly what Naomi Klein described in the shock doctrine, right? And exactly the power of what she described there, in the sense of not necessarily anything new, but brought that idea to a wider audience and described it in Milton Friedman's own terms, i.e. as in the terms of the architect of that process of management through crisis and governance through crisis. Crikey. Impossible. That's good, isn't it? I can't spell. I spent hours. I've got no handwriting ability, right? I spent all my breaks practicing handwriting. For what reason? I never write anything now. And spelling, I'm useless to that, but the computer does that for me too, so it doesn't really matter most of the time. And this is by way of a plug. So a recent article came out 2 weeks ago now, of mine and my collaborator Paul Beekman's, where we argue exactly that crisis is part of the governing strategy of the European Union. So that's a plug for my paper. I won't go through the general argument, other than if you look at anything that the European Union does, its headline strategies, it regularly and repeatedly sets up a set of objectives to compete with the rest of the world. Says we're going to be, in 10 years' time, we're going to be the best at this. Reviews it every year now, and each year, and then at 5-year points, it's midterm review, and then when it gets to the end of the period, it says, we failed, we didn't do it. And the recipe? More of the same. Now, if, there's a certain, in one sense, if you see that as a logical exercise, that's stupidity, right? Why, if you keep doing things that keep failing, why would you keep repeating them? That's the definition of stupidity. Except for it isn't stupidity at all, because failing to do it is entirely, according to Paul and I, entirely what is intended in the first instance, because failing to do it becomes the rationale and the logic to repeat the exercise once again, and also to overcome domestic opposition to those reform agendas. As a good friend of mine, Stuart Shields, pithily summarises that the time for reform is always now. There's always a justification for repeating the reform. Now, the one thing we don't talk about in there, and purposefully we wanted to talk about the rest of Europe and not bailout countries. But in bailout countries, arguably, what you've got is a Chile-like experiment, which is how much will people suck up and still carry on? And I want to return to that idea as governance, as a crisis as governance, at the end of my more pessimistic analysis. Right, so I'll go quickly. What we've got, I've got another plug. What we've got is crisis as everyday, crisis as systemic punctuation, and crisis as governance strategy, right? And what all that means is the processes by which managing those three things, and spatial expansion, as I've already said, are organised, are probably one of the most important elements of contemporary capitalist development. And next 2 weeks' time, or a week on Tuesday, myself, some of my PhD students, David and Priyan, who are in the room, and then some of my colleagues, are going to be talking about our research, which is looking at the idea of frontiers, not just in physical space, but in frontiers in the way in which that process is managed. And one of the contributions will be to look at gender politics in the UK and across Europe, and female labour power being one of those frontiers open for contestation and social struggle. Right, I'm going too slow, always go too slow. So, systemic punctuating crises in the way that Paul Mason wants to talk about. Of course, we can think about having seen these in two different transitions in that kind of post-war or interwar to post-war to neoliberalisation period. We can think about the crisis of the 1930s and a transition to a post-war welfare state, social democracy and so on, managed capitalism. And we can think about that as a transition in the 1970s to something that we might want to call neoliberalisation. And then the question then becomes, where are we now? And I suppose where Paul is much more optimistic that we're in this bottom corner, I'm kind of representing that as at least only a partial part of the explanation, and actually Angela and George are much more powerful parts of that explanation right now. All that begs a question, right? Whether we are in this post-neoliberalisation or post-neoliberalism phase. And I've got to acknowledge, obviously, that this is, like crisis, another one of those ambiguous terms that is very often used. And Boas and Gansmore, I always use this with students, it's one of the best articles, I think, about saying just how diverse the meanings attached to that idea of neoliberalisation are. But for me, and the way in which I'm using it in this discussion, is to think about neoliberalism, or as I prefer, neoliberalisation as a kind of a process, as being not about a particular set of policies. So not about monetarism, privatisation, that kind of Washington consensus list of policies, but about a set of governing strategies that implies a way of making policy for sure, which is to insulate it from democratic control, to induce crisis, as I've already said, to repeatedly experiment with new types of policy, in order to affect redistribution, and redistribution between labour and capital, upwards, and between, or I think it's probably unhelpful to put it as I did on the slide there, between productive and finance capital, but with the effect that capital in general, or finance capital, becomes the predominant actor in that process. And at least up till now, promoted by a range of actors, the UK state and the US state being primary among them. Some of the organisations I've got on the board have also been important in that process, but perhaps no longer, and perhaps a more important, or we're witnessing a transition to that process being led more importantly by the Chinese government and the Indian government. So, are we then witnessing a crisis in neoliberalisation? Well, let's return to some of those kind of hastily put together criteria. And if it's about a generalised crisis for accumulation, not really. A little bit of a crisis of accumulation. Look at the figures, and people making money again quite happily and quite easily. The growth is not necessarily, or high levels of growth are not necessarily important. What's important is that capital manages that process of circulation through its stages and realises surplus value. And you can see that very as a proxy, at least in the inequality figures. So if you look at the way in which inequality figures have changed, and I argue in other papers, will change in the very near future, because there's a kind of data lag and recording issue right at the moment. But if you look at how that will change, you can see that process of accumulation resuming. Have we got a legitimacy problem? Well, yeah, at the margins, Occupy and Syntagma Square, and you can see that legitimacy problem manifested, but it's not a generalised legitimacy problem. I'm willing to bet most of us in the room have just carried on our lives. We might feel differently. I'm not criticising you or me or any of us, but that, we carry on with our lives regardless. Geopolitical shift, yes, and that's that shift I just talked about being important. A crisis of social reproduction, well, yeah, I can see that manifesting itself. I can see that manifesting itself across Europe, for example, in declining living standards. But here is the big rub. Whoever said that incrementally increasing living standards, access to good quality healthcare, democracy, access to good quality and free education, whoever said that they were central parts of capitalist development? It might well be entirely possible to erode all those and still maintain stable accumulation over a long period of time. And unfortunately, I'm kind of skipping ahead now, but I'm kind of aware of time a little bit. Unfortunately, that would be where I am with my analysis. I would open up. I can see a new politics of inequality, right? So that's something I write about, in the sense that I can see an increasing contradiction and an increasingly obvious contradiction between the material reality of how people experience things like inclusion within a kind of new middle class, right? I can see that. I can see people feeling increasingly anxious. I can see people worrying, will we be able to afford for our kids to go to university? Will our kids be able to get on the property ladder in the way that we did? I can see all those anxieties. But that doesn't necessarily mean that we will experience a collapse of neoliberalism as we know it. It seems to me that it's entirely possible to experience that in continuation of the legitimacy and the manipulation of ideology. And Cameron going to the Tory party conference and talking, our bigger objective is going to be inequality. Well, yeah, okay. Or a national living wage. You can see it in the kind of manipulation of those kinds of ideas. But it doesn't seem to me to suggest that, I'll not talk about any more about spatial expansion, but it doesn't seem to me to suggest that necessarily that system will collapse as a result. And my worry there, so I'm going to pose three observation come questions, open questions. So I don't fully know what I think about these. It's not a research paper, it is just my thoughts, right? So one, is there a transition is a transition evident in kind of embryonic form? I'm kind of sceptical of that. But I don't think it's out of the question. It's a political process. I just don't see the politics coming to press. Are we seeing a social transformatory group with the people with the white cables in their ears? I don't think so. I think, I'm not saying they're not politically active. Some of them are. I'm not saying that the skills that Paul talks about in the book of coding and so on I think actually he's probably right that they do have generalisable problem-solving capacities within them. But those skills have been eroded. Most, the people that are experiencing that through iPads have no capacity to do any of that stuff. Most of my students are less tech-savvy in the sense of being able to make the machines do stuff than my generation. What they're much better at is using Facebook, right? And a final observation, kind of open question, would be about the environment. If there is a constraint, it would seem to me to be an environmental and ecological one more than a political and social one, precisely because of that space to continue expanding that we currently have. That said, that generation that does do the coding, they seem pretty well equipped to me to be able to find at least piecemeal tech solutions to that problem as well and maintain accumulation in that context. So pessimistic observations come open questions. Hopefully we'll stimulate debate to finish with. Okay, thank you.
Okay, we've got 5-10 minutes for any questions that you might have for Alex.
Thanks for the talk, really great. I was just thinking about, throughout it, the sort of role of agency or subjectivity in what we're talking about, because I think your point that systematically, obviously capitalism, there's no real reason to believe that this is the end crisis after so many crises. But I suppose people like John Holloway or artists or sort of more optimistic people might be looking at the idea that it's people that produce capitalism. It's not just something that carries on, and there's a sort of degree of faith and belief in that economic system that keeps it going. That's how it's reproduced. And supposedly, I suppose the way that people are thinking about this is where the transition might occur is people just not buying into that idea anymore, which is a sort of subjectivity, collective subjectivity idea. So I just wondered if you had any sort of comments on the idea of agency and subjectivity within this kind of slightly more pessimistic view that you've got.
Definitely. Do you want to collect a few and then
We can take two time.
Thank you very much for the interesting talk, Alex. My question is, where does conflict expansion come within the spatial distribution?
Where is conflict within that process?
Conflict expansion in terms of military conflict.
Oh yeah, okay, yeah. Do you want to sort of take those?
Two, or do you want a third?
Well, let's have three. I mean, actually, I can wrap those two up together.
Perfect.
I think,
So something slightly different then.
I've not actually read the book, but I guess when we're talking about the people with the earphones, we're talking about Silicon Valley. I'm not, no.
A bit broader than that. I think that's pretty. I'm answering for him, but that's kind of the heartland of it, I suppose. But I think he means a much more popular process than that, and sharing on Wikipedia and open source coding, which is much beyond that, right?
But there are a lot of disruptive technologies coming out. Are you pessimistic about those? Like, for example, crowdsourcing financing for companies and that kind of thing, because they could have a quite big impact on the way things are.
Yeah. Okay. Do you want to take all those three? Yeah. In terms of agency conflict, actually, I think Galina might answer your question, at least partly. It seems to me, exactly I agree that agency is hugely important. This is why maybe I didn't dwell on that enough in terms of being, these are open transitions, it doesn't, there's no particular, I'm not saying these are structurally inevitable, right? There are certain structural processes that are underway, but they are contested, right? And so, so if we go back in time to one of those previous transitions, it mattered that people were mass mobilised, that they'd experienced a war, that they were coming back with a collective sense of identity. So that agency really mattered. I guess what I'm pessimistic about is not that I don't think there are disruptive forces and they're not cracks in capitalism. I do. I can see that all the time. But are they systemically transformatory? I don't think so at the moment. And in terms of, that's what that picture was. In terms of agents, I would, and we can point the finger in this at academics quite happily, right? So I had a really big debate at a conference on it was a panel on critical theory at the International Studies Association last year, where some really big names in critical theory, supposedly critical theory comes from Marxism, from the kind of Frankfurt School, intervention and so on. And basically it was, you shouldn't really try and change things because, universal solutions, they'll always end up bad in the end. Angela Merkel hasn't listened to that. She is changing the world. Right? George Osborne hasn't listened. He is changing the world. Right? So if we want to look for powerful agency, I can point you in the direction of it. The Chinese Communist Party hasn't listened. Right? They're pretty happy to change the world. But the balance of agency, I see, the balance of class forces is just so much in favour of continuation of neoliberalism, or neoliberalisation as I see it, rather than transformation of it, I would say. And this picks up this point that you raised about militarism. I've got a colleague who sometimes I think is, he wants me to think he's bonkers, but, sometimes I do think he's bonkers. Dr. Steve Wright. It's all right, because I'm going to come on to say something nice. And he talks all the time about the militarisation of society, about the securitization of borders, because people fleeing processes of expansion in some cases, or from not having expansion. It's like Joan Robinson says, right? The worst thing about not being exploited, or the worst thing than being exploited, is, guess what, not being exploited. And so people fleeing from that, and you can see that in the refugee flows and the economic migrant flows. If you want to divorce things like that, it seems fairly pointless to me. But in that process, you can see exactly a process of securitizing borders in order to prepare for that. And as I say, one way of reading the Southern European situation at the minute is as a kind of laboratory experiment for, how far can we go with the disciplinary politics? Can we suspend democracy and sustain the system? Well, it turns out pretty easily. Right? Can we repress social movements? Yeah, pretty easily. And can we start to secure Europe's borders? Well, that's a bigger question. But it seems to me that rearmament and investment in military technology is exactly a reason or connected to the story that we're talking about. And then the final thing, Krauss, I don't know. I guess what you'd have to say is means of accessing finance. Do they change the purpose for that finance is put to? And if this is just a way, if you've got a credit market tightness that restricts access to capital for some social groups that are wanting to engage in that circulation process, and they find another way, crowdsourcing, then does that really change the relationship? It might mean that credit's a less disciplinary relationship, and I don't know enough about crowdsourcing, to be honest, about interest rates and how they're discipline, the discipline associated with them. But it seems to me that, if that's simply used to perpetuate different forms of the extraction of surplus value, then it's unlikely. I suspect quite a lot of crowdsourcing, like business startup, is not really that at all. It's just about people exploiting themselves, right? It's about people working for themselves and managing their own exploitation, which can be liberating, or it can be just mean you work even longer hours and spend even less time with the kids or whatever.
We've got time for 2 more questions. Very quick. One there and one there.
Okay. Sorry,
Yeah. Sorry, no, the development of robotics seems to be coming on apace, with Google having acquired several companies. I mean, how disruptive is that going to be?
About as disruptive as the last robot generation, I would imagine, in the sense that, robotising factories, and we're, robotising aspects of our daily lives. And I don't really, again, I'm not a tech person, but I presume you think about the self-driving cars and, all that kind of stuff.
Well, just a lot of the jobs that are done at sort of quite a low level now, just, it's going to mean a lot of displacement, isn't it?
Yeah, I mean, it further drives, the mechanisation of production, the replacement of labour with technology, which is an essential part of the competition endemic to capitalist development, right? That's the iron law that enforces the crisis tendencies in those 2 circulation processes that I outlined.
So you don't think we're going to get to Keynes' situation where we're all looking around for nice leisure activities that we can employ ourselves in?
Now this is where this fragment on machines is kind of potentially important. It's not that the technology itself, although if you sat with some types of technology, it might feel like that. But it's not necessarily that the technology itself is exploitative. It's the social system in which it's deployed. And the one thing I think is positive about Paul's book, and actually probably a lot of people like me might kick him for, is his suggestion that you can use some of that technology to release labour time, or to create leisure time, or to use governance technology. So he kind of employs the kind of nudge idea. And it seems to me that you can at least think about how you might use governing technologies like that to manage in a different situation. So David Harvey talks about that in terms of performance management and corporate structures. And he said IBM doesn't doesn't leave things to the market, it plans how it produces stuff, right? You know, Volkswagen, as we see, he doesn't leave stuff to the market, it organises how it's going to produce stuff. And those very clever people doing that very clever problem-solving work, including mechanising how we produce stuff, might well have some of the solutions that you might utilise in a different social structure. But it's the social structure that matters, and therefore increasing mechanisation in the workplace just looks like the continuing trend that we saw in car factories, you know, years ago, and you know, might replace me sometime soon. You know, so it doesn't seem any different to that to me. So.
This is less of a question about the world system, as it were, and something a little bit more local than that. But you suggested that we're only seeing legitimacy crises on the fringes, but looked at within the context of the UK and what the British state is sort of experiencing at the moment, there is a bit of a legitimacy crisis happening in Scotland. It's starting to rumble a little bit in England, and given that you identified the UK as a driving force in neoliberalisation, how would you insert an analysis of this growing legitimacy crisis here into the analysis that you've made of the world system?
Yeah, sure. I mean, I totally agree with that. That's this kind of idea of a new politics of inequality. And when I say that there's this increasing, not just increasing contradiction between the promise of inclusion in a new middle class and its reality, but also an increasing realisation of that fact. And I think to an extent, I might be pushing it too far really, but to an extent you can see nationalism in Scotland, a very particular type of nationalism, right, being about at least as much about the London banker as it is about external others. In fact, it's got this really peculiar dynamic, a nationalist dynamic of being more open to the external world and closed to London finance, right? And so I see that as a reaction. Actually, in a very similar way, I see UKIP as a reaction to that. The polling evidence on UKIP voters is really interesting in the sense it shows that while they're politically conservative, they're more or less exactly as in favour of redistribution as Labour voters. And that seems to me to be an evidence of alienation from that process. But it isn't transformatory at the moment. And, you know, and this is why I say it's an observation and I'm pessimistic, but it is, I do think it's an open question. That yes, potentially there is that, and you know, books like Paul's. This is why I said by the end, actually I've got to be more positive, because that is at least somebody trying to intervene in that debate, and the people that read that book, like me, are going to start thinking, well, you know, how do I think about these issues? And that is in itself liberating, at least of the mind, you know, and that seems to me to be a really important thing. So yeah, possibly there's some openings there. I would say though, there's lots of agents even, looking at how you might manage that process. You know, so I sat in the office of one of the senior managers of the IMF, telling me exactly the recognition of those dynamics and how the IMF is changing its work. You listen to Christine Lagarde, she'll tell you she wants the IMF to change. If you listen to Cameron talking at the conference, that realisation that inequality is a big issue is significant, even if he's not genuine. Right? It's a significant process nonetheless.
So some positivity as well as some pessimism.
Yeah, not much, I'm afraid. There's some tea and coffee left.
There's biscuits. Positivism. Just join me in thanking Alex for his brilliant